Mathematics here at Stanford University. And I would like to welcome all of you to this event and celebration of Ramanujan. This is sponsored by the Department of Mathematics together with the Agastya International Foundation and its supporters. So we are going to start with three brief talks by three of our faculty professors here at Stanford, Tadashi, Tokieda, Brian Conrad, and Kanan Sandarajan. And so without further ado, let me introduce Tadashi Tokieda, who will start.
Ramanujan was born and grew up in the region of Tamil Nadu in the south of India. And if you expand it, you can see that he was born in Erode here, and it's really in the south. And the town of Kumbakonam will appear very prominently in our discussion. And then, somewhat incidentally, this town, Namakkal, which appears. And Chennai used to be called Madras. That's where he worked briefly. And he died at the age of 32, shockingly young, a little more than 100 years ago. To have a chronology, we shall start reviewing his life, but in the upper right corner, I put the countdown of the number of years left in his life, at each stage of his life. So he was just born in 1887. At that point, he had still 100% of his life left. Okay, so he was born a Tamil Brahmin Iyengar. So there are two kinds of Tamil Brahmins, Iyengar and Ayar. And he was a Iyengar kind. His father was clerk in a study shop, and his mother was a housewife. She also sang in the temple occasionally. And in fact, those two parents had three younger siblings to Ramanujan, but they were all dead before their first birthdays. That says something about the condition of living. And during that more than a decade, from 92 to 1904, he was schooled in that town of Kumbakonam, that's in the lower right corner. And he did very well. At that time, by the time he finished schooling, notice that he has already spent 50% of his life. So he was 16, and that was half over. His life was half over. Okay. But anyway, he did very well in school. It turns out he was still a student, and he earned a scholarship to Government Arts College in Kumbakonam. But then, during that time, towards the end of his schooling, secondary schooling, he got hold of this very, very famous book, which, as Howard says, is now assured of immortality, which its author couldn't have dreamt of, by Carr, Synopsis. So this was a training book for people who take mathematical exams in Cambridge and in the first year, and he just had lots and lots of results with very, very sort of modest proofs and explanations, and more than 500 formulas that were in kind of very stark sort of presentation. And this got Ramanujan started, young Ramanujan started in private research in mathematics. Here is the frontispiece of the front page of Carr's synopsis, and synopsis of elementary results in pure mathematics. Yeah, propositions, formulae, and methods of analysis with abridged demonstrations. Abridged is exactly what it was. So he was a scholar in Cambridge, and he later taught as a tutor in London. And this was taken from the library of Berkeley, actually. So there aren't so many copies left. And nowadays, Hardy himself says that it's now practically unobtainable in the 1920s. But Cambridge University Press has a program of reprinting classics of mathematics, and I have to confess that I was a consultant for this program. So in addition to having great sort of treatises on mechanics of the 19th century printed, I confess that I campaigned for this one, and I hope it's now selling at something like $30. It's always available if you want to have it. So this is the synopsis of mathematics, and a little bit of commercial there. Then started a series of setbacks in Ramanujan's life. So he was so focused on mathematical studies that he neglected everything else, especially English. So already in the second year of the Government Arts College, his scholarship was not renewed because he failed most of his exams. So that was terrible. So he ran away from the college to the north of India and didn't return for a while. And then, having lost his place in college, he tried as an external candidate to take something called the first arts examination. This would have, for anybody who succeeded, to enter the university, in this case the University of Madras in Chennai. but he fell very, very gravely ill the first time, so he couldn't really take it, and he failed anyway. And the second time, a year later, he tried, and he failed again, so he couldn't get in at all. So now he was left without any diploma of any kind, and he had, on top of that, repeated illnesses, and he had an operation, which will become a little significant later on, in 1909, and the convalescence was extremely slow. By that time, he has only 36% of his life left. Okay. And then, in 1909, he married Yanaki, who was very, very young at the time, arranged marriage to be sure, and they lived in poverty. Actually, she lived with her parents for a while, and then anyway, they were very, very poor. 34% of his life left. And this is Yanaki, and in fact, there aren't so many photographs of hers left. So this was in old age with her adopted son. And then that's kind of a little younger. She made a living as a seamstress, and I believe that sound actually met her. Yeah. But we can't really have many more photographs. Yeah. By the way, Ramanujan later, you'll see, went to England for 5 years, and he was writing letters to Yanaki, but his mother, Ramanujan's mother, intercepted letters, and they didn't reach her for a number of reasons. Anyway, so in 1912, he became accounts clerk of Madras Port Trust, and he was earning the grand sum of £30 a year. In today's money, it's about $6,000 a year. So you can see how poor they were. Yeah? And by that time, he has only 25% of his life left. He still hasn't started. 1/4 of his life is there, but that's all. And then he begins to write to professors of mathematics in England, yeah, because that's the economy of power. And upon the recommendation of some friends, he writes to M.J.M. Hill, and in London, he gets a very lukewarm reply, recommending him to read something like Bromwich's Infinite Series. He also wrote to two very prominent mathematicians of the time, Hobson and Baker in Cambridge, and he got no replies. Okay. By the way, there are lots and lots of fluid dynamicists. Hill was a fluid dynamicist, and then this Hobson, real analyst, and Baker did abelian functions and so forth. Okay. And then, a fateful and the amazing, the lucky decision, he writes to G.H. Hardy in Cambridge. So this is a narrative after C.P. Snow. I modified it in order to make it a bit more realistic. So that's Hardy, around that time that he received a letter from Ramanujan. One winter morning, I shall read it through. In 1913, at Trinity College, Hardy found among the letters on his breakfast table a large, untidy envelope with the Indian stamps. In it, sheets of paper on which were line after line of formulas. He felt irritated. World-famous mathematicians are here exposed to cranks. He glanced at the letter, written in halting English, signed by an unknown Indian, asking him to give an opinion of these mathematical discoveries. Some of the formulas looked familiar, others were baffling, most of them wild, crazy looking. There were no proofs of any kind. It seemed like a curious kind of fraud. He put the manuscript aside and went on with his day's routine. That day, while the routine wasn't altered, at the back of his mind, the Indian manuscript nagged away. Wild formulas, such as he had never seen before nor imagined. A question formed itself in his mind: which is more improbable, a fraudster of incredible skill or an unknown great mathematician? In the evening at Trinity, he had another look at the script. He sent word to Littlewood, his colleague and very, very powerful mathematician, that they must have a discussion after dinner. By 9 p.m. or so, they were in Hardy's rooms with a manuscript stretched out in front of them. That is an occasion at which one would have liked to be present. This is Snow speaking. Hardy, with his combination of remorseless clarity and intellectual panache, Littlewood imaginative powerful humors. It did not take them long. Before midnight, they knew, and knew for certain, the writer of these manuscripts was a great mathematician. The following day, Hardy went into action. Ramanujan must be brought to England. So, in 1914, Ramanujan sails to England, helped by two people, that is E.H. Neville, and the right picture is Teshu Iyer. He'll come back to it later on. And also famously goddess of Namadiri, and of the town of Namakkal. So, countdown is that he has 19% of his life left at this stage. So he arrives in England, rather seasick, and then he's taken by car to Neville, by Neville, and he lives in Neville's house for a while in Cambridge, and then he's put in his college. And he starts a life of very, very, very intense work. Did I say very, very, very 3 times? Another one, intense work, and collaborations in notably with Hardy. And then he came at a wrong time, because this was the time of the First World War. Yes, there was deprivations and rationing and so on, and he fell very, very ill and was confined to a sanatorium. At that time, he was diagnosed as this illness was diagnosed as tuberculosis, and many biographies will still talk about tuberculosis, but in fact, there is not an ancient study, a modern study that says that it was amoebic dysentery of the liver, actually, and which was curable, and in fact, British soldiers who came back from the First World War were being cured routinely, but Ramanujan had no such treatment, unfortunately. And 1916, he got a BA by research from Cambridge, that's equivalent to today's PhD, and then he is publishing during this time, and next year he attempted suicide on the London Underground subway track. And then he was arrested by Scotland Yard because it was crime to commit suicide, tried to commit suicide, but Hardy intervened, and then he was taken out of custody. And in 1918, he's elected Fellow of the Royal Society. This is the equivalent in Britain of the member of the National Academy of Sciences in this country. And he was actually the second Indian in history to be so elected after Kutsetji in 1841. He was a shipbuilder and an engineer. So often it is mentioned that he was the first Indian, but it's not true. There was an earlier Indian. But certainly a great honor at that time. Remember that India was a colony of the Great British Empire and was treated as such by everyone. And then, soon afterwards, a few months later, he was elected Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and he was certainly the first Indian ever to be so elected. There are some interesting stories about this, which I can tell you regale with at the reception later on about this election. It's very, very salacious stories. And then, 1919, he finally says back to India, I was not keeping track of the number of years left. By that time, he has only 3% of his life left. Did you notice that? Countdown there. Okay? And then, 1920, he dies, 0% left. Okay. So I would like to insert a story that is well known to everyone, but with a little twist. Hardy recounts a story, and I'm telling this story with some agenda in mind, that he was visiting Ramanujan when he was very ill in Putney, near vicinity of London. So he says, Hardy tells the story. Ramanujan was lying ill in Putney. I had ridden in a taxi cab, number 1729, 1729, and remarked that the number seemed to be rather dull one, and that I hoped that he was not an unfavorable omen. No, he replied, Ramanujan replied, it is a very interesting number. It is the smallest number expressible as a sum of 2 cubes in 2 different ways. Like so, yeah? So 12 cubed plus 1 cubed equals 10 cubed plus 9 cubed. So in 2 different ways, and there's no smaller number which can be so expressed in 2 different ways. I asked him, Hardy asks him, naturally, whether he could tell me the solution of the corresponding problem for 4th powers. And Ramanujan replied, after a moment's thought, that he knew no obvious example and supposed that the first such number must be very large. Indeed, it is very large because it's this number. And so 154 to the 4th power plus 59 to the 4th power equals 134 to the 4th power plus 133 to the 4th power, and this was known to all that. Amazing, huh? So Littlewood said, J. Littlewood, said that every possible positive integer was one of Ramanujan's personal friends. By the way, I think I have a little extra time, so I'd like to tell you the story that in the Hardy's narrative, it first said in the Galley proofs, he said, as a wit once said, every positive integer was one of Ramanujan's personal friends. And Littlewood was reading through the Galleys and said, oh, that's a very nice remark. I wish that I had said it. And in the printed version, it says, as Littlewood said. Okay. Now, this story of 1729 is often kind of adduced as an example of, oh, what the genius and what the kind of strange character, what the incomprehensible brain Ramanujan was. But I'd like to actually impress upon you that probably that's not the right impression. I mean, far be it for me to impose anything, but I would like to have another interpretation, which is kind of endorsed by Hardy elsewhere, who knew him very well and who cared deeply for Ramanujan. And he says, you know, it's all this kind of great, of course, aura of Ramanujan, but there is quite enough about Ramanujan that is difficult to understand. And we have no need to go out of our way to manufacture mystery. For myself, I liked and admired him enough to wish to be a rationalist about him. And I want to make it quite clear to you that Ramanujan, when he was living in good health and comfortable surroundings, was as reasonable, as sane, and in his way, as shrewd a person as anyone here. The last thing which I would want you to do is to throw up your hands and explain, here's something unintelligible, some mysterious manifestation of the immemorial wisdom of the Orient. The picture which I want to present to you is that of a man who had his peculiarities like any distinguished people, but a man in whose society one could take pleasure, with whom one could drink tea and discuss politics and mathematics. A picture, in short, not of an alien wonder, or an inspired idiot, or a psychological freak, but of a rational human being who happened to be a great mathematician. And indeed, you see, there are lots and lots of really extreme talents in mathematics, absolutely bizarre people, but the point is that we're all humans, and I think it is much, much more inspiring. Instead of saying that, well, he's an alien, look at all those photos. Yeah. There are so many photos of Ramanujan, and I think there are only 2 or 3 more photos in existence. I collected almost all of them. This is the famous photo that appears as a frontispiece of his collected papers, and that's just before he goes to England, and then he's surrounded by his friends. And this is at the matriculation at Cambridge University. Ramanujan is in the middle. You see how actually short he was. And that's Hardy, by the way, on the right. And that's Eddington here, and so on. And look at him. So behind this photograph was a human who was looking at the world from inside the photos. And so I think rather than say that he was an alien, it's much more inspiring if we say that yes, he was really exceptional, but he was a human like the rest of us. And despite all his troubles he had plenty, and tragedies he had to cope with, he still did so much. He was a human like the rest of us. The bibliography I would like to suggest 3 items. So G.H. Hardy, Ramanujan 12 lectures on subjects suggested by his life and work, Cambridge University Press. That's based on lectures at Harvard's Centenary Conference. So by this time, Harvard's about 400 years old, is that right? Okay. And then another one is, so this is really a very great one, and then most of this is about the commentary on Ramanujan's mathematics, but there's a lot of mathematics by Ramanujan that has been understood, put in proper context only later, which will be the topic of the next 2 presentations. Also, Brent and Rankin published from the American Mathematical Society Ramanujan's correspondence. That's very, very interesting reading. And finally, of course, the corrected papers of Srinivas Ramanujan, which are edited by both 3 people. Seshu Iyer was one of the closest friends of Ramanujans in India, and that's Cambridge University Press also. And there are 2 biographical notices, one of them by Seshu Iyer and Ramachandra Rao, another one by Hardy, and they are in really sharp contrast, not only of style, but of approach and sort of spirit and so on, and both repay really great scrutiny. I recommend them very highly. And finally, please note how much Ramanujan published. If you look at corrected papers, you notice that there are 10 papers, 50 pages worth from India period over 4 years. You remember that he had a very, very short period. Yeah? And 27 papers, 270 pages from England over only 3 years. So I hope that his legacy will continue, but how it continued will be the subject of the next 2 presentations. Thank you.